Tonight, Badger State Battleground.
Madison liberals are trying to take over the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
National implications in a race that will determine control of Wisconsin's High Court.
Extremist Dan Kelly wants abortion banned.
Plus, mixed signals fuel economic uncertainty. And global support for Ukraine.
And Ukrainians don't have any choice but to win. That's why we fight till the end. Glory to Ukraine.
As the war enters year 2, Ukrainians worry over the well of aid running dry. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Abortion takes center stage as Wisconsin voters decide who will sit on the state's Supreme Court. Good evening in Washington, I'm Jenna Browder. A life or death election. That's what pro-life organizations consider the battle for control of Wisconsin's Supreme Court. Right now, conservative judges hold a one-seat majority that Democrats are trying to win. With major cases on abortion, political boundaries, and crime expected to make it to the state's high court. Caitlin Burke has our top story and why many see this race as 2023's most important statewide race. Caitlin?
Jenna, this is a high-stakes election. In other states, we've seen voters get the say on state issues like abortion. In Wisconsin, however, laws can't be overturned through ballot initiatives. Those decisions go to either the state legislature or the high court, and both have been in Republican control for over a decade.
Madison liberals are trying to take over the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
Extremist Dan Kelly wants abortion banned.
On April 4th, voters will decide as Republican Daniel Kelly faces off against Democrat Janet Protasewicz.
This is going to be an election like no other.
There's too much at stake, way too much at stake for us to stop for even a moment.
As key cases appear headed to the state's high court, the outcome of this race could have implications on issues from redistricting and voting rights to deciding whether abortions will be permitted here. Since the primary campaigns began, groups on both sides have been pouring money into the contest. Now, the general election is expected to become the most expensive state Supreme Court race ever.
We invested 6 figures in the primary. That primarily went to voter outreach through calls, texts, mailers. We're going to have an even bigger investment this time around that we'll be announcing in the next few days.
As Susan B. Anthony, Pro-Life America, makes a major push for Kelly, Director of State Public Affairs, Kelsey Pritchard, says it's time for organizations like hers to take action.
We're at risk of having many row decisions that nullify the laws on the books that save lives and protect the unborn. And so it's really crucial that we be engaged in these races going forward.
While Wisconsin Supreme Court candidates may take conservative or liberal positions, court seats are officially nonpartisan. Carrie Severino with JCN says the key for voters is to choose the candidate who will uphold the Constitution rather than legislate from the bench.
We see a real contrast there with one judge saying, I'm going to vote for change in Wisconsin, trying to change the abortion law, trying to change the state redistricting. Whereas Judge Kelly is committed to saying, no, we need to be looking at what the law says.
Also in jeopardy pending the outcome of the April election, Republican laws enacted when they had full control of the state government. Jenna?
And joining us now, former governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker. Governor, welcome. Great to have you with us this evening. So Politico has called this the biggest election of 2023. In your own words, why is this Wisconsin Supreme Court race so important?
Well, it's the classic battle between a traditional judicial conservative, Dan Kelly, who I appointed to Supreme Court years ago, and as I call her, No Jill Janet, someone who is not only an activist trying to aggressively impose her own will and that of her liberal funders, but who has, as a circuit court judge in Milwaukee County, the largest county in the state, has actually consistently either given no or very little jail time to some very serious offenders. So this is a classic matchup that not only is big on the issues, but could have ramifications for things like redistricting, which in 2024 could affect what the boundaries are for congressional districts. And in a tight race for majority of the United States House of Representatives, that could be the tipping point. So they're pouring a lot of money in, hoping to impose their activist agenda on Wisconsin and on the country.
One of your big wins as governor was the passage of Act 10 for viewers at home. The measure eliminated collective bargaining for most public employees, among other things. Governor, are you worried that a liberal-controlled court could repeal this signature piece of legislation of yours?
Absolutely. We've seen both federal and state courts over the years, time and time again, uphold this law, whether you like it or dislike it, although I would argue it really fundamentally took power out of the hands of the big government union bosses and put it firmly into the hands of the hardworking taxpayers. Those reforms still work today, not just for tax savings, but putting the best and the brightest in the classroom. But aside from the discussion of the merits, you've got judges who I think people agree, whether it's a circuit court judge, court of appeals judge, or in this case, a state Supreme Court justice. Members of the judiciary are there to uphold the law and ultimately the Constitution, not to make the law. You want to make the law, run for the legislative branch. Unfortunately, No Jail Janet and her allies have gone out and essentially she's making promises about what her values are, signaling to people they're going to get rid of our Act 10 reforms, they're going to get rid of prohibitions on abortion, protecting the sanctity of life. They're going to aggressively impose their agenda and even go beyond reversing reforms that we've done in the past to potentially even opening the door for things like no cash bail or early release of criminals, things that really are on the radical fringe and certainly out of place in the state of Wisconsin.
This race, of course, getting a lot of national attention. Governor, what are the national implications in this particular race?
Yeah, you're going to see not only the largest amount of money spent ever on a state Supreme Court race in Wisconsin, it will probably be, for sure this year, and probably be the most costly race for a Supreme Court race in the country. And that is just phenomenal. But you've got a combination of two things. You've got years of pent-up frustration from radicals from New York City and Washington, D.C. out to San Francisco and beyond, who now would love nothing more than being able to fund a reversal of our reforms, even though they weren't able to do it through the normal legislative process, electing a governor and a legislative majority that would fulfill their wishes out there. So they're going to try and undo that. The other part, as I mentioned, specifically when it comes to things like the congressional boundaries, if you look at radical plans for redistricting that would gerrymander potentially one, if not two, Republicans out of House seats in the state of Wisconsin. We said all along, just give us fair seats and we'll be competitive. But they could gerrymander in a way where at least one, maybe two of those House Republicans from Wisconsin could get bumped out of a seat. If they do that, again, in a tough election in 2024 where every member of the House is going to be up for election, that could affect who holds the majority in the future.
All right, I want to switch gears here a little bit. In regards to the White House in 2024, many polls still showing Donald Trump leading among Republicans. Governor, will you support the former president?
Well, I'm going to support the nominee. I think he has earned the right to be the front runner with the tremendous policies he and Mike Pence and the rest of his team enacted during his 4 years in office. And I appreciate the good work that he's done. But this is ultimately up to voters. It's not up to pundits. It's not up to the party. It's up to the voters. And I think there's a lot of voters who love what Donald Trump did as president, many of whom plan on voting for him again. There's a lot of other voters I hear from as I crisscross the country who say, I love what Donald Trump did as president, but they might be open to someone like Governor Ron DeSantis, Governor Glenn Youngkin, people like former Governor Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State under President Trump. There's a number of names out there that I hear people are interested in, and they love what he did as president, and many of them plan on continuing to support him, but others are looking for someone else. And in the end, I think the bottom line is we can't lose sight of just how radically out of touch Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the radicals in the White House are, that we got to make sure that however the process works in the primaries and caucuses coming up in 24, that conservatives get behind one solid candidate once they win the nomination and get this nation back on the right track.
All right, Governor Scott Walker, we appreciate your time this evening. Thank you for coming on Faith Nation.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
In economic news tonight, new unemployment applications fell for a third straight week. Labor Department figures out today showing 190,000 people applied for new jobless claims. That's down 2,000 from the week prior. marking the 7th straight week new claims were under 200,000. And in the private sector, the number of jobs is growing. ADP reporting 475,000 new jobs added in February, well above the 400,000 predicted. And here with us now is Mark Hamrick, Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst for Bankrate.com. Mark, good to have you with us in studio tonight.
It's great.
Yeah, in person. So, every week we talk, it seems like we're talking about unemployment applications continuing to go down. How long can we see this trend last?
Clearly, the job market has remained more robust and resilient longer than just about anyone expected, and most importantly, longer than officials with the Federal Reserve have expected. And so, as we've discussed before, Jenna, this is a situation where good news is, in a way, evolving into bad news, because just today we have a Federal Reserve official saying the job market remains too strong, and we know that their response to that will be to keep interest rates higher for longer. They've got another rate meeting coming up in late March.
This week we saw the private sector jobs report 475,000 jobs. Only 400,000 were expected. What do you think we can expect when we get the February jobs report later this month?
Well, these are always two separate data collections or data sets, so we don't want to take too much away from ADP and say, therefore, the federal government report should be, let's say, stronger than expected. But let's remember, the January reading, we had more than 500,000 jobs created. The nation's unemployment rate fell to 3.4%, lowest since the Beatles were actually still, a thing. I would say the risk is to the upside, meaning the job market may indeed have been stronger in February than expected, and part of that mix is there's still a lot of job openings out there.
As you know, of course, it's tax time. Bankrate's looked into this, of course. How is inflation factoring into this tax season, Mark?
Well, first of all, people are worried for all kinds of reasons that they will not get as much in terms of an income tax refund this year than they would have in years past. It's still the #1 cash windfall for most households, and so a lot of people are essentially waiting for this refund if they haven't gotten one already and are anticipating one, hoping that they'll get it. And of course, not everybody's filed yet. The filing deadline for federal filers is later this year, April 18th. The other part is that the child tax credit, which was essentially part of the response to the pandemic, in some cases will be reducing some of those refunds. So that concern is legit.
Yeah. On recession, if you Google the word recession, you'll get a bunch of articles saying that we're headed for it, and you'll get a host of other articles saying that, it never happened and we're not going to hit recession. Where do you fall on that?
Well, I think the consensus is that one is, let's say, the risk is there for the second half of the year. For, among other reasons, the Federal Reserve wants to cool off the economy. It's doing almost all it can to do that. And it's important for people to remember that it could well be that a mild recession will be less hurtful to their personal finances than the high and sustained inflation that they've already had to contend with.
Yeah. Speaking of the Fed, what's next?
So we have a meeting in about 3 weeks. We should expect at least, I would say, probably another 3 rate hikes. If they see good news on inflation, which we're still waiting for again after basically having had a new pickup, then they might take their foot off that brake. But that's something to wait for.
Yeah. All right. We'll wait and see. Mark Hamrick again. So good to have you in studio tonight.
Thank you, Jenna.
All right. Thank you. An Afghan interpreter risked his life to help Americans. How one former Marine did the same to keep the interpreter safe. That story and more next. Welcome back. Poor planning, a chaotic withdrawal, and a lack of oversight over U.S. weapons. A government watchdog cites those as reasons the Taliban quickly took control of Afghanistan when the American military pulled out in 2021. A new report this week from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction also notes a failure to create an independent, self-sustainable security force. Despite the U.S. spending $90 billion over the 20 years troops were on the ground in Afghanistan. The Taliban takeover meant danger for any Afghan who helped an American, some even facing death. That's what led one Marine veteran to risk his own life for the sake of his Afghan interpreter. Mark Martin brings us that story.
When Marine veteran Chad Robichaud learned about the Biden administration's plan to pull the U.S. military out of Afghanistan, he thought it would be a disaster.
So a full withdrawal and a surrender of Bagram Air Force Base, I knew it would be catastrophic for national security, for global security, and stability in the region. And it's just not consistent with how we deal with post-war conversions as America.
Having served 8 deployments in Afghanistan, Robichaud tells CBN News his first thoughts centered on innocent people stuck in a country led by a brutal regime.
Additionally, my biggest concern was our allies, those who fought beside us for 20 years, being left behind. One being my friend Aziz, who did 15 years in special operations, 8 deployments with me, saved my life multiple times, and just my friend.
I was really worried about my children because my relatives, they turned their back at me. My friends, my parents, everyone, they're like, you're not coming to our house. This is your call. You did it. Now you handle it. And I cannot go to relatives. I cannot go to friends. And it was a total chaos. It was for me, it was like the end of the world.
14 years after Robichaud's final Middle East deployment, he organized a rescue mission to save Aziz, his wife, and 6 children. Once in Afghanistan, the situation on the ground led to change.
One of our team members noticed this group of 3,500 orphans and said, hey, let's not just get Aziz's family, let's get these orphans as well. And we kind of paused for a second. All of us are Christians. We all felt the burden that God put in our hearts to just help as many Americans, interpreters, their families, women, children, Christians that be persecuted. We just want to help as many people as we could.
The goal became a mission to save thousands from Taliban rule. Altogether, Robichaud and his coalition of heroes evacuated more than 17,000 people.
When the military was forced to leave after that Abbey Gate was blown up and 13 of our service members were killed, we chose to stay because we knew the White House was saying there was 100 Americans. We knew there were thousands of Americans, thousands of allies. We knew we still had the ability to help, so we did.
Robichaud shares his story in a new book titled Saving Aziz. He gives readers a behind-the-scenes look at what happened after the chaotic withdrawal of the U.S. military, describing the miraculous evacuation efforts during Afghanistan's historic humanitarian crisis.
The book's important to us, not to sell books, but it's important that the story gets out.
And the man whose name is in the title also sends his own personal message.
To please keep the Afghan poor people in your prayers, because I strongly believe in prayers. And even with this evacuation thing, I prayed in the name of Jesus and he answered. And, it all happened as a miracle for me.
He kept us safe. He gave us clear thinking and opened doorways that were impossible for any man to open. And we were able to do this incredible thing and just be part of it. But ultimately, God orchestrated it, and all glory to him.
Mark Martin, CBN News.
Aid from around the world has poured into Ukraine. But as the war enters its 2nd year, how long will that last? Details when Faith Nation returns. A surprise meeting today between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, marking the first time the two have spoken in person since the invasion of Ukraine more than a year ago. The 10-minute conversation took place at the G20 summit. A senior U.S. official reporting Secretary Blinken hit on 3 main points, including America's unwavering support for Ukraine, that Russia should rejoin the New START nuclear arms control treaty, and that the Kremlin should release Paul Whelan, an American imprisoned over allegations of spying. For more than a year now, military and humanitarian aid has been pouring into Ukraine. But as Chuck Holton reports, even as global support remains high, Ukrainians are starting to worry the well of aid could run dry.
As war grinds into its 2nd year, Ukrainian troops on the front lines near Volodar are resolute, grimly resisting daily Russian attacks in the midst of incredible destruction.
They try to surround us, but they aren't succeeding. We are lucky to have a resourceful commander, so things are going well. I can stay calm knowing we won't be surrounded.
Civilians here are mostly of Russian descent, although that makes no difference to the invaders.
Today is the 9th day since my sister died. We feel bad. We don't know anything. We have no water, nothing. I'm here getting rainwater to wash with.
65 countries, hundreds and hundreds of private companies, and millions of individuals have sent money to support Ukraine over the past year. And believe me, the people here are very grateful for it. But they are concerned that the world will just move on, and they know that that aid is absolutely vital to their survival as this war goes into its 2nd year. And that's why they've taken so much hope from the commemorations and marches that they saw around the world over the one-year anniversary.
From Argentina to Armenia, Berlin to Brazil, and Warsaw to Washington, D.C., hundreds of cities held vigils protesting the war as it enters its second year. Standing with Ukraine and against Vladimir Putin, many of those involved are Russian.
Well, what we have here is Russians protesting against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. These are people in the opposition to Putin. Everybody talks about how the Russians are brainwashed. These people aren't brainwashed. These are Russian citizens, Russian emigres who are saying that Putin's murderous war in Ukraine is not okay. That's a very important thing to be seeing right now.
If Ukrainians will stop to fight, there will be no Ukraine. And European Union will have the border with Russia. And then maybe you will need to fight. If Russian will stop to fight now, there will be no war.
Marina Litvinenko's husband was killed by Russian agents in 2006.
I'm very proud to see this big crowd of Russian people, a lot of young people, maybe never went to this kind of protest. But I saw their faces, how they're against the war, how they support Ukraine, how they hate Putin.
This really tells you how upset everybody is, how upset real Russian people are about the murder that's going on in Ukraine right now.
This global swell is very motivating for those who have spent the past year on the front lines.
We fight for our children, for our fellow Ukrainians, and for our nation. Because I think what Russia is doing now is genocide. And Ukrainians don't have any choice but to win. That's why we fight till the end. Glory to Ukraine.
From Kyiv, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Still ahead, a midnight flight to outer space. A look at the latest SpaceX launch next. Finally tonight, one heck of a ride. Those were the words from NASA astronaut Woody Hoberg shortly after takeoff this morning. He's one of 4 astronauts currently making their way to the International Space Station. Their SpaceX Dragon capsule took off from Kennedy Space Center just after midnight, illuminating the night sky off the East Coast. The crew will spend the next 6 months at the International Space Station. The capsule set to arrive early Friday morning. And we will leave it on that note this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great evening.